Hi, everybody. Welcome to My Favorite Mistake. I'm Mark Raven. And our guest today is Erin Joy. As the founder and executive consultant behind Erin Joy Business Coaching and Consulting, Erin uses over 25 years of experience in entrepreneurship, roundtable facilitation, business strategy, and executive coaching to help fellow female business owners launch, propel, and grow their companies. Her website is erinjoy.com. And before I tell you a little bit more about her, Erin, thank you for being here. It's great to have you. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I am doing well, and I'm thrilled to talk with you and your audience about my favorite mistake, what I learned, how it's changed my life.
Well, happy to talk about that, and we'll learn more about your work and your business. Erin has hosted over 300 roundtables, 200 group coaching calls, 70 live events, and 1,000 online events. And the company continues to serve over 60 clients. Erin's currently pursuing her Ph.D. in business psychology at the Chicago School of Professional Psychology, so she can enhance her ability to connect with and support women in business on both a professional and an emotional level. And she's also the host of a new podcast. So congratulations for that. It's called Erin Joy Talks Business. And I'll encourage people to go find that wherever you're listening to this little podcast. And congratulations. We'll talk about that more later on. Congrats on the launch.
Thank you so much. I look forward to being as smooth and have everything worked out like you do one day, Mark. I'm getting there.
You
have a lot more episodes under your belt than I do. And there's an art and a science to this.
And I sometimes still stumble through things like a minute ago, and I'm usually not too proud to go back and, or I'm usually not proud enough to go back and edit. I kind of stumbled over her and here, and so it goes on.
It's not worth it. It's not worth it. And it doesn't matter, right? What really matters is the value that you deliver to your audience, and that's what you're about. That's what I'm about, and that's what matters.
And every time I hear like a real professional broadcaster stumble over anything, it's not, I think, well, okay, look, none of us are perfect, and I'm not going to be too hard on myself. It happens.
Smart. Isn't that kind of a leadership lesson right there, that we have to give ourselves space and grace to fail?
That's one of the core principles and themes of the podcast series here. And so from when we talked before and from the work you do, and I'm sure your story is going to demonstrate, I think you're really aligned with all of that. So, Erin, what would you say, looking back at the different things that you've done in your career, what is your favorite mistake?
Well, there really are so many, and there are so many that are favorites, and they're favorites because of how I grew and how I changed and what I learned about myself through the process of failure and through the process of making mistakes. The one that I really want to share about today is related to pandemic and the trajectory I was on pre-pandemic. So leading into pandemic, I was heavy into a business model where I was preparing to franchise the roundtable or peer advisory group side of my business. And I loved the idea of making money off of my intellectual property. Experts say that consultants and coaches can really make serious money one of two ways. Number one being intellectual property. And number two being building a consulting team, a coaching team where you're profiting off of your team. And I made the decision to head down the path of intellectual property. So licensing or franchising my model. And this would have been a very heavy lift and a very expensive endeavor. And I was well down this path. I was just about to engage a franchise attorney, and I would have been investing $50,000 in legal fees to get the franchise disclosure documents where they need to be to really grow this side of the business. And it's not that model would not have worked. It's that it would have taken a very long time to pay off. And it would have bogged me down, where my model would have become me servicing my franchisees versus making a direct impact in the lives of women entrepreneurs and making an impact in the lives of more women entrepreneurs. But, I noticed, Mark, as I was reflecting on this mistake, which I've been reflecting on over the last 2 years, I had to let go of this idea that I had that the intellectual property play was the right play. And I had to let go in order to lean into other aspects of my business. And what that took from me is me letting go of an idea that I had fallen in love with. This is what entrepreneurs do. We are innovators. We see opportunities in the marketplace and we go after them. And that's what I was doing. There is an opportunity for someone else to provide this service to women entrepreneurs, but it's not going to be me. And the letting go of an idea that I had fallen in love with and that I had been working for 10 years towards. And, letting go of that was not easy. And yet it was the right thing for me. And I think isn't that kind of part of the dynamic with a favorite mistake, is that it's not easy to admit, but admitting it is the right thing so that you can move forward.
So thank you for sharing that. What I hear you saying is the mistake was spending time going down that path, but in a way you avoided what could have been a bigger mistake.
Oh yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. I think it would have been a huge mistake for me to continue down that path. And so when pandemic hit, and in that first week in March of 2020, I pulled the plug on the franchise model. I knew that we were in this thing for 18 to 36 months. That was my assessment at that time. And that I needed to pivot because within 18 to 36 months, this franchise model was going to go nowhere. And so I had to let it go and respond to what was happening in the world and in the marketplace and shift.
So I was going to ask you, Erin, what was it about the pandemic? Because there was a lot of uncertainty there. Right? I worked as a consultant in healthcare. I was working with the health system. We knew this was going to be bad. And when we decided, okay, well, I'm not traveling there anymore. We thought, this was people in healthcare, we'll see in a few months. Well, it was for me 23 months before I got back out on the road. And so, there was a lot of uncertainty. We weren't using Zoom as much then as we are now. I mean, I'm curious, I guess back to the question, sorry for my detour. My question is, what was it about the pandemic that made you think this franchising model wouldn't work? Was it because the roundtable was structured around getting together physically in person? Is that something that could have adapted to more of a virtual Zoom world? Or was it just too unknown?
I think it was both. It was the adaptation to Zoom didn't work. I did switch to Zoom for these peer advisory roundtable experiences for my women entrepreneur clients, and it didn't work well. There are so many things that transferred to Zoom just fine. And there are things that did not. And a peer advisory roundtable experience is one of the things that did not transfer well to Zoom. And I gave it everything I had. And it was just obvious that it wasn't going to work. The other piece was that in-person meetings were clearly going to be off the table for a good while. And while none of us really knew how long it was going to be, I had a kind of a beat on info coming out of Wall Street. And my Wall Street contacts were saying that they were bracing themselves for 18 to 36 months of volatility. And I took that on. I said, that's the mindset I'm going to take on. I'm just going to embrace that this is our new reality and that we don't know how things are going to look, and that chances are pretty good this model is not going to work under any circumstances, any reasonable circumstances for the next several years. And I need to let go, cut my losses, and move forward.
Yeah. And so I guess that speaks to the efficient markets theory of, a handful of people in one health system, or even the people, say a federal CDC level who were trying to figure things out versus the wisdom of the markets. That's an interesting insight that you were able to tap into. And thanks for sharing that. What was your pivot then after giving up this idea?
Well, I still found myself, and I still find myself today, deeply committed to making a positive impact in the business lives and the personal lives of entrepreneurs. And so I pivoted to some endeavors that didn't produce income at that time, but I knew that I would leverage them down the road. And so when I let go of my entrepreneur peer advisory group roundtable model and the idea of franchising that, and I really devoted myself to supporting my local community in figuring out and making sense of early pandemic, and put a lot of energy into pulling my community together and providing content for my community. I created the State of St. Louis Business weekly call with local leaders. I created the St. Louis Small Business Task Force. And I put my energy into these kind of community involvement efforts, knowing that I would later turn around and leverage this effort and monetize it, which is what I'm doing now. So I used this early, pandemic experience when I was making a shift and making a pivot to invest further into my community of entrepreneurs, not knowing exactly how I was going to leverage it or monetize it later, but I knew that I would. And so that's where we are now. And I've launched a talk radio show in St. Louis, Erin Joy Talks Business. That's the podcast you mentioned earlier. It's both a podcast and a radio show. And I'm able to use and leverage those relationships from that community leadership into the success of the show.
That's great. That's great. You figured out. Sometimes these things feel like the right thing to do, even if the full path forward isn't clear. I think starting this podcast was a similar thought process for me. There's not really something to directly monetize, but yeah, I've learned a lot. I've met some great people. It's helped my thinking, and could lead to some things here in the future, I think.
Absolutely. I think that's a difficult decision to make as a business leader, is do we invest in something that doesn't have a clear path to monetization right in that moment? And a small business might be able to do that and be more nimble about that kind of effort than a large healthcare organization or a large organization. And so it was the right thing for me at that time. And it sounds like podcast, for an example, was the right thing for you at that time. And just like I had to let go of the peer advisory group, I mean, there were things about that community leadership that I did have to let go of. And what I'm focused on now is, how do I now monetize everything that I'm doing? Because I have invested myself and given myself to my community, to my local community, to the community of women entrepreneurs. I've given and given and given and given, and it's time to cash in. And that's what I'm doing.
Yeah. Well, and I think, one trait of entrepreneurs, as you touched on earlier, is testing ideas, evaluating ideas, not falling so in love with an idea that we can't shift or pivot or know when to exit, right? There's the difference between, I think, an entrepreneur who has one idea and that's their life's purpose. And even if it's a slog for a long time, for them, maybe that's the right thing. If it's fulfilling some sort of purpose, and it takes, time and stick-to-itiveness. I know that's not really a word. And then there are the quote unquote serial entrepreneurs who are like, well, okay, I'm going to try this. Nope, didn't work. I want to learn that quickly. Great. Shut it down, move on to something different. It sounds like you, or how do you help people, kind of learn how to let go? Because that might be easier said than done. Let go, move on to something different.
Absolutely. That definitely relates to the why behind the initiative and why we are in this business anyway. And I find that so often the letting go gets tangled up in our concern for what other people will think about us and our motivations that have us in business or in entrepreneurship in the first place. And for myself, I've recently uncovered, after a lot of years of deep personal introspection, and I have recently uncovered that there was a lot more of me wanting to prove myself to people than I realized. And I think that my clients get wrapped up in that, having something to prove. Maybe it's to their parents or their spouse, or in my case, the kids I grew up with, the students I grew up with in my small hometown in Litchfield, Illinois. I realized, I've been fighting to prove something to them. And so I think we have to first get to the bottom of why we're doing what we're doing, because when we've got some maybe maladaptive or dysfunctional reason for why we're doing what we're doing, there is no clarity. There is no freedom to let go. There is no letting go happening because we're tangled up in the thing that we're doing. So I help people untangle so that they can be as free and effective and powerful in business as possible.
Yeah. And so the things you're saying there, to me, I guess that seems clear of why you have gravitated toward your PhD work in business psychology. How would you define business psychology? Is that somebody serving as a psychologist to entrepreneurs, specifically to business leaders, even if they're not an entrepreneur?
Business psychology is an offshoot of the original body of work being industrial psychology or organizational psychology.
Okay.
And business psychology is a bit of an offshoot from that really is focused on small and medium-sized companies and the intersection between business and psychology. And so I always liken that to the idea that entrepreneurial businesses will grow in relationship to the entrepreneur's growth. So entrepreneurs who are not growing personally and professionally, their companies themselves will be stunted. So I like to really work at the intersection of these two disciplines and take a very holistic approach to business and to my work with clients, where the business owner herself is developing herself. She is bringing a kind of psychological lens to her work with her team, thinking about her business, thinking about herself more holistically, and then also partnering that with all of the tried and true business distinctions of great, operations leadership and management and human resources and marketing and all of the solid disciplines that we have to be great at in business. So it's a very holistic approach to business and to success.
And it sounds like there are some really fundamental concepts when you talk about this definition of self. I mean, somebody could define themselves as I am my business, or I am an entrepreneur, or maybe even something more broadly, like I am a problem solver, or I am service oriented. That might then lead to a certain business within entrepreneurship. Or are there, how do you help someone figure out the right framing of self that encompasses their professional life and their whole life, their whole self?
Well, it's different for everyone. It really is different for each person based on their why. Why are they in business? When did they get into business? The entrepreneurial journey of a woman who's in her 50s, was always an employee in this organization, but now had the opportunity to buy the company. Her journey is a little different than someone who, let's say, is in their mid-20s and just has the drive and can bootstrap, or perhaps has access to capital from their parents, or whatever the case may be. So it's very different. And, I think that's really important that entrepreneurs are getting support and getting the right support for where they are in their journey. And there's no one right way or out of the box solution. It really depends on each individual.
Sure. So you talked about, and there's a video I saw on your website where you talked about having a 25-year plan. And I think, there's a thought I heard once, this goes back to quality guru, management guru, W. Edwards Deming, who was a big influence on me. And he talked about how, he used this phrase that management is prediction, that we need to be able to predict. And then I think at some point test our predictions over time. And so like what you shared in your story about you had a prediction that a franchise model would be fine. You explored that, you tested it, you pivoted. So I'm curious, back to your 25-year plan. Like, I have trouble seeing maybe even 5 years into the future. Maybe I can use some help with that. But when you have a 25-year plan, how specific are the details of that plan? Is it a high level plan that gives you wiggle room as things evolve? Tell us more about that.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely a plan that is high level, that gives me room to change and to pivot and to adjust. Just like I discussed a moment ago with the change from the peer advisory groups to these new models where I'm much more focused on group coaching. I'm much more focused on my mergers and acquisition services and one-on-one private coaching and consulting with entrepreneurs. But going back to the 25-year plan, what's interesting about that is that I did, in fact, have a very clear vision now 11 years ago about exactly what I wanted to do with my life, with my career, with my business over the next 25 years. And I've spent 11 years executing on that plan.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm on track. I'm on track with the things that I am doing to build my brand and educate myself and impact my clients. And it's a good thing that there's some wiggle room, because 11 years in, as I see some of the motivation for my 25-year plan, I see some of the dysfunction in my motivation in the 25-year plan. I'm now rethinking things quite a bit. And I'm rethinking not the content of the 25-year plan, but the context. I didn't know that the context included I'm going to show you. And I'm someone who's done a lot of deep work on myself. And this was hidden from my view. I didn't know that this was underneath the plan and underneath my motivation. So as I have, thanks to pandemic, thanks to my mistakes, thanks to looking, more deeply at myself at this time. I'm 48 years old. I've got 2 years of this pandemic under my belt. I'm parenting a middle school daughter. It's a very dynamic and interesting and exciting and challenging time in my life and in my business. And so I'm using these as reasons to go deeper into myself. And it's like I'm getting a flashlight out and looking around into all the dark corners where I thought I had explored before, why I do what I do and why I am the way that I am and how I became the person that I am today. And there were some things hidden in the corner that I didn't know about. And as I've been looking over there in that corner and seeing that my motivations aren't as pure as I would like them to be, they're not as authentic as I want them to be, that I've got more work to do, that I've got more healing to do, to let go of trauma from my past that had me have something to prove to people. And so while I'm still on the same 25-year plan, the context is shifting, and context is decisive. I mean, the context that we hold for anything determines everything, how we view it, how we relate to it. And so I'm in the middle of a major transition. I might have to come back in like 5 years, Mark, and tell you my later favorite mistake, because I think they're changing.
Yeah. And I mean, a plan like that, a 25-year plan, I'm curious, how did that, I don't know what the right words are. How did that reveal itself to you? How did you discover that? Was it kind of a epiphany, or did it take time to consciously say, I am going to develop this vision and this plan?
Both. I have always known that I was here to make an impact and to make a positive impact and to be as free and as self-expressed and as powerful as I possibly can be, and to support my clients and my community in their version of the same. And so that is just like in my bones. And how that has unfolded through the years has been, some of the things we've talked about here, me supporting women entrepreneurs, hosting roundtables. I host a ton of events. I've got a radio show, a podcast. I love to produce workshops and big networking events and content. I want to give away as much as I possibly can to support other entrepreneurs in having great lives and great businesses.
Yeah.
And so there's been a blend of just having that innate sense inside of me that this is what I wanted to do.
Mhm.
And then combining that with my strategic thinking and strategic training around how to not only create a vision, but then execute a vision over a long period of time, because it takes a long time to build a business. It
Mhm.
takes a long time to build a brand. And so I could just see, and I think this is just part of my skill set that I've developed, is being able to see how to execute on a vision, how
Mhm.
long it'll take, all the moving pieces, what's involved, what to execute on, and in what order. It's just what I do.
Yeah. And as you work with, or as you think about your own plan, and as you work with others, as life throws different challenges at us, whether it's pandemic or business challenges, what can we do? How do you help people be more resilient so we can better adjust to those things that are unexpected?
Well, I think for me, that resilience really comes from a couple of different places. And this is my framework for working with my clients. Number one, we have to look at what we have overcome in the past. And we know that resilience builds on top of resilience, and that basically, the more difficult things you go through, the more resilient you become,
Mhm.
and you learn and grow from each of these challenging times. And I personally have been through some very, very difficult times in the last 20 years. Um, Really challenging things in my personal life while being a single mom and an entrepreneur and a graduate student. And I'm in one of those times now. It's definitely in a top 5 most challenging time in my life.
Mhm.
And so I myself am looking at the things that I've done in the past and reminding myself that I can do hard things. I've
Mhm.
done hard things before.
Sure.
And that, when pandemic hit, for example, early on, this is not the case right now, but for the
Mhm.
first 2 years, I was like, I can handle this. I got this. I've been
Mhm.
through really hard things. I know how to do hard things. What I'm experiencing right now is a little different. Um, and so, in addition to knowing that we can handle hard things and looking at what we've handled in the past and what we've learned, and really leaning on that and pulling that forward proactively, like really thinking hard about how we've gotten through these difficult things in the past,
Mhm.
distinguishing what made a difference for us and bringing that forward into today. That's
Right.
number one. Number two is framing these challenging times in some kind of a spiritual domain.
Mhm.
Whether I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking about something that's more spiritual and focused on the understanding that things are happening for us, not to us.
Mhm.
One of my favorite frameworks is the idea that the universe is always conspiring on my behalf. And so,
Yeah.
right now, in this moment, even though I'm in one of the top 5 most challenging times of my life,
Mhm.
remembering that it's breakdowns that lead to breakthroughs.
Mm.
Really, that is the way it
Yeah.
works.
Yeah.
Remembering that the seed of success is found in every one of my major failures,
Mhm.
that it's the really difficult and challenging and downright terrible things that have happened in my life that have provided the most growth and the most opportunity. And so those are the things that I focus on for myself
Mhm.
and with my clients.
Yeah. And again, our guest is Erin Joy. I will link to all of Erin's social media platforms, and her website again is erinjoy.com. But something I snagged off of your Instagram, and I'm gonna print this out or just put it in my collection of quotes on the themes of this podcast. You shared this quote. I'm going to read it and I want to hear your why what it means to you, or elaborate on it. So the quote says, "Never beat up on yourself for what may seem like a mistake. It was necessary for you to walk that path to learn those lessons." And it's from Stimit Chopta. Hopefully, I'm saying his name correctly. But that's a powerful notion, and that's something we explore a lot here on My Favorite Mistake. Tell us more about what that quote means to you.
Well, I think that when we're going through these difficult times and when we make mistakes, knowing that walking through it is where the gift lies, I think gives us more strength to keep walking and to purposefully learn what there is to learn. When I look back on my life, and I've made so many mistakes in business, mistakes with men. I'm a single woman. I've been single for 18 years.
Mm-hmm.
I've made a lot of mistakes in business, with men, with money. Those are probably three categories with the biggest mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And, I was doing the best that I knew how to do in that moment. And when you know better, you do better. And I mentioned earlier that I've been, looking into the dark recesses and the dark corners of my life with a flashlight to see what else is there for me to learn? Where do I need to grow? What mistakes have I made that I'm making right now and don't even know that they're still mistakes?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that overall, the journey is really about my journey. Perhaps your audience, if they're interested in mistakes and learning from mistakes, is really about how to let go,
Mm-hmm.
how to let go, how to lean in, how to admit our mistakes so that we can learn and grow from them.
Yeah, well, absolutely. And there's a video I'll link to in the show notes as well. I saw where you talked about letting go, and as you've touched on here today. I want to ask one other question about your work, especially with women leaders and entrepreneurs. Are there common mistakes that you in let's say in their career transitions? Are there common mistakes that you would help them avoid, or is it more a matter of setting them up to recognize and learn from mistakes? Because I'm curious where you help people find that balance, maybe.
Well, my work with women entrepreneurs and women executives is interesting in that women who are making a transition, certainly letting go is a piece of that.
Mm-hmm.
We have to let go of the way things are now and be comfortable being in a state of transition in order to lean into a new state and move forward. And that's kind of a psychological change process that we have to get good at.
Mm-hmm.
And so women who are making transition in their careers have to be able to let go, have to be able to look forward, and get the support of the people in their life to support them in their transition. Maybe that's their employer, their coworkers. Maybe that's getting people to look at them differently, to relate to them differently, to relate to them as the CEO of the company, not as a manager of the company, if that's the kind of transition that they're in. And the ability to strategize these kinds of moves, to think about image and communication and transition and letting go, that's recommended to do that with an executive coach, whether that's me, that's you, that's others in the marketplace. Making these kinds of bold and major changes alone is not recommended. Going deep on strategy and support is what's recommended.
Yeah. And then one other thing, I know something that's important to you is not just working with the women leaders of today, but to help build the next generation of women as leaders. You mentioned your middle school daughter and that next generation. What do you think needs to be done, to best close gaps in opportunity and equality for women as leaders?
Well, my answer might not be popular, but
Okay.
people in power,
Mm-hmm.
which are often men,
Mm-hmm.
often white men,
Mm-hmm.
need to wake up to the damage to our society, our entire environment, our capitalism, our economy. Everything is impacted by the lack of equality for women in the United States, in the world, in the workforce. And so when I think about this question, I think less about what women and girls need to do
Mhm.
and more about what decision makers need to do. And
Mhm.
there's a lot of research that exists from amazing academics and work groups and civic organizations that tell us exactly what we can and should be doing in the United States to support women and girls and to create
Mhm.
more equality and equity, more pay equity, for example.
Mhm.
And I would like to see more leaders and decision makers leaning into that material,
Mhm.
working with consultants, working with experts, and changing things in their own organization.
Mhm. I personally, I think that's very fair and accurate the way you framed that. So it's not a matter of what do girls or women need to do differently, and it's not, it's not this paternalistic. Men need to help the women. Men need to help change the system that white men, have
Designed.
designed and benefited from, and I have benefited from. And you're right. It takes, I think, issues related to gender or race. There are similar things where I've talked to guests and friends who are Black or people of color who say, again, you can't put the burden on the people who aren't in that power group to change the system. They have a role to play, and but like you said, the sort of the predominant groups need to let go, maybe, to use
That's
your
right.
phrase, and let others in.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
I'm with you.
it's a big bold conversation and one that I
Mhm.
intend to go make some mistakes on because it's not a popular conversation.
It's not.
It's folks who are in power like the fact that
Sure.
there's this inequality. It creates more cash for their businesses and more profit for their shareholders and stakeholders, and there's no real benefit
Mm.
to making that change that they think.
Mm.
And so I'm going to go make a bunch of mistakes having
Yeah.
this conversation in public forums, and
Right.
I'm scared, but I'm going to do it anyway.
Well, these aren't easy conversations, so it may feel like we do make mistakes or that we're about to, but we need to have those discussions anyway. So, Erin, as you continue in the early days of your radio show and podcast, I think it's interesting how you frame it. It sounds like you're looking forward to the new mistakes you're going to make.
That's what I'm telling myself.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna take that on. You, me, and your audience. We're gonna take on looking forward to our new mistakes.
Yes. Keep learning from them, and off you go. So, congratulations again on launching the radio show and podcast. You
Thank
mentioned
you.
being challenging times. I think it shows resilience of being willing and able to launch something new during personally challenging times. So thank you for sharing your story, your journey. I think it's great to hear about a near mistake, if you will, or a small mistake that prevented a large one. That's really powerful. So thank you, Erin, for sharing all of that with us today.
Thank you for asking. It's just great to talk about this with you and your audience. Thank you, Mark.
Yeah, thank you for being here. Again, our guest is Erin Joy. Her website is erinjoy.com. That's easy. It's a nice, short, straightforward URL, erinjoy.com. And you can check out her show no matter where you are, Erin Joy Talks Business. Thanks again, Erin.
Thank you so much.